So I got a quick video today. I was working, or I am working on my next larger video, which is a 2025 Ukraine nuclear escalation. Kind of because what would lead into it and what it would look like if we were to go down that route would look different than, say, in 2024 or 2023, or different periods of the conflict. Initially, the thought process behind it was Russia's losing, they're detonating a low yield, high altitude strike as a warning, and U.S. engages in conventional sense, and it escalates from there. Well, Russia's not losing right now. I mean, it's a turned into an attritional war, and Russia's got a larger pool of people and resources and industrial capacity. And so, not to say necessarily they're winning, and I know people have started to say, for some time the Ukraine front would collapse. But people have been saying stuff throughout the entire conflict, that they thought Russian morale would collapse. They're already, I mean, it's a lot of stuff that didn't come to fruition. But suffice to say, the idea that Russia being pushed back, or Ukraine even advancing into Russia, I mean, it's not going to happen. We're not. It's just conflicts turned in as such that it's become attritional, and they're going to eventually, grind Ukraine down unless some other factors change. And that's where I look at a scenario. Okay, if it was to escalate to this point, what would be the different things that could lead into it, and how would that look like? One of them would be the U.S. authorizing additional long range strikes by Ukraine using U.S. or Western weapons. They did a little bit, but it was just in the Kursk region, and it was very limited in nature. And it could look other things. I think one of the biggest things that could lead to something like that would be Western troops in Ukraine, even if it was in a capacity of securing like their non-frontline areas. I think that would be one avenue that we could see. So it's kind of based around that. But as I was doing that, I was thinking about one of the other major flashpoints that could lead to a nuclear escalation, especially when I'm looking at it, Western and should be the two big ones between Russia or China, and this would be over the Taiwan and reunification of China. And so I think that's what this video is going to touch upon just briefly, and it's just some thoughts. So it's not trying to provide any answers, but I think there's a lot more of a cavalier attitude of, I would say, quote unquote, it's safer to engage China in a conventional war without escalating into a nuclear war than there is that same attitude with the United States and Russia, or even Russia and the United States, because Russia's went out of their way to not get in a direct confrontation with the United States. Just the United States has went out of their way to not escalate to a certain level with Russia. Um, so in China, they don't. There doesn't seem to be a lot that same level of concern. Part of that is traditionally China has kept their nuclear arsenal kind of at the level of France, which is above Great Britain, but well below the U.S. and Russia, and it's still well below U.S. and Russia, but it's growing. It's definitely larger than France now, and it's estimated to be about 500 warheads. Not all of those warheads would be able to reach the continental United States, but it's growing, and it's going to be continuing to grow. And there's thoughts right now to, at certain time periods in the near future of getting to, 1,000 warhead capability. And, the United States and Russia both have about 1,700 warheads deployed. There's more in reserve, and there's also ones waiting to be decommissioned or destroyed. Um, but that comes back to another thing. This nuclear material doesn't really go away. So even if we were to dismantle the weapons, that you can utilize them potentially in future stuff. But that's, look, I'm not a nuclear scientist, so leave that to the other people to go down that route. But my point being that this big disparity in nuclear forces is going to start narrowing. And I think part of that is that China kind of believes that the United States doesn't take their nuclear deterrent as serious. So they want to increase from a more minimal deterrence level to a closer parity level so that the United States doesn't think they have free reign versus the way they approach with Russia. They've increased their amount of silos. Not all those silos necessarily have active missiles or warheads. I know people say, "What's the point of it if it doesn't?" Well, there's a lot of points for it. If you have, say, 100 missiles, but you have 400 silos, then the United States has to target 400 silos, you know, for to take out those 100 missiles. But again, that gets into more, nuclear strategy and tactics. But if I say there's a reasoning behind having a greater number of silos. That was part of the MX missile program that was kind of envisioned at underground rails in the United States, where we could actually be shifting the missiles from multiple silo locations, so the Russians would never be, or Soviets, would never be able to know exactly where they were, and they'd have to expend even more and more missiles. Unfortunately, though, if they're close to silo locations, that means you're going to get hit with more and more stuff. So, hey, nuclear war is not fun. So as we look, and I think people downplay that possibility because, I mean, right after Christmas, separately in two different sixth generation demos were flown by China. Now, there's a lot of debate online what does sixth generational air fighters actually mean and whether it qualifies, how far along the program they are, and whether or not the United States has actually test flown some of their sixth generation, at least demo wise, already, and capabilities and stuff. And again, it's all very legitimate conversations around all that, and that's not, really where my focus is. But it's just to say that China's making an extremely concentrated effort to be able to exceed capabilities of the U.S. Navy and Air Force. And of course, this conflict is in their own backyard versus the United States, where we're obviously several, the other side of the world. And so we'd have to be fighting in their backyard. And we have allied air bases. I know popularly, that one South Korean leader in the late 70s and 80s said basically South Korea is a gigantic U.S. Aircraft carrier. But, that's they're all vulnerable. They're all going to be within range of the large number of ballistic missiles China has. We don't have nearly the amount of hardened aircraft shelters we need. Now we could be doing dispersals and more austere air locations. There's a lot of stuff, the United States has obviously put into place or planning around to mitigate those factors. But it's always going to be difficult when you're fighting on one side of the world and your enemies in their own backyard. Um, in fact, it's a unique position the United States is that there is no adversarial country that has any capability to really project their force to be in our backyard. Now, there are weapons in a conventional sense being developed that, can ensure that we don't have necessarily a free lunch, that we can strike the Chinese mainland and the Chinese can't strike our mainland without going into a nuclear thing. They've worked, there's been thoughts about conventional warheads on ICBMs and other systems that could potentially strike U.S. mainland being conventional level. Obviously, there's several on the nuclear level. But, what happens? I mean, what is that? So if we're out there and China is hitting our bases, but they're not on our soil, so it could be bases in Guam, it could be bases in Japan, South Korea, Philippines, but we're striking their mainland because look, I mean, where else are we going to target? So do we get a free lunch? Do we get to strike their mainland? At what point? They have no first use policy, but what a point are they saying that they're, we're crossing a red line, that we're putting their strategic national interest at risk? And maybe they do escalate to a nuclear level. Now, they've reiterated a no first use policy time and time again. But again, it's always one of those things. Well, I could say, hey, I could tell my neighbor, like, hey, I'm never going to, um, you know, throw a baseball through your window unless you throw one through mine first. And then I could get drunk and throw a baseball through their window and say, well, even though I said I never was going to, I still did it. Well, it's no first use policy. But I mean, they have said that, and along with their minimal deterrent levels, it was pretty genuine. But maybe China isn't even the first one. What if we find ourselves in a situation where we're completely outmatched and outgunned? Our aircraft carriers are potentially getting sunk and we're losing lives. Do we escalate with tactical nuclear weapons to change the tide? Or are we going to walk away defeated? I mean, what happens to that as a nation of morale? If we get into a shooting war and we end up on the worst side of it, how does that going to, how is the United States going to handle that? In World War II, there's Pearl Harbor, but we had an industrial capacity that we could replace losses. We could end up, we mobilized, we did all that stuff. We don't have that necessary building capabilities as a country now that we had then, that we could replace naval losses at a large level like that. So even if we had the will to fight and the desire to fight, we need those capabilities to be able to fight over there. And how do you tip the scale? Well, tip the scale by utilizing nuclear weapons. And that's how things can escalate and everything. So I think the idea that it's safe to fight China in a conventional sense, I think is a very dangerous way of thinking. And I think that's where we have to keep in mind when it comes to whether or not we're going to defend Taiwan in the event that they do choose to use a military option or even a maybe not necessarily through strikes or an actual invasion, but even a blockade or something like that. If we're going to defend them, a to the people of Taiwan, are they going to hold out? Are they going to want to stay liberated, or are they going to, give up and start throwing their weapons down and surrender and stuff? At that point, we can't fight for people that don't want to fight for themselves. So you have to ensure that's going on. But second, is it going to be worth it? So would it be worth it to take a risk of a nuclear escalation so we save Taipei, but we end up losing Los Angeles and New York? I mean, is that the trade-off we're going to have? Some people probably watching and say, well, I'll just lose them because they don't like politics or whatever. But from an industrial and economic standpoint, the loss of New York and Los Angeles would be absolutely devastating to our country, all jokes aside. Um, so is that a worth risk? Is that what we have to say? I mean, we could say probably right now until we build up our chip manufacturing that yes, it's a worthy risk. But something we always have to ask ourselves. I think there's some tough questions to have to be asked there. A, are we providing the funds to the U.S. Navy and Air Force to be able to achieve that kind of a victory in a adverse situation like that, being on the other side of the world? Are our allies in Southeast Asia going to be willing to put themselves at risk for the defense of Taiwan? So is South Korea, Japan, Philippines, are they going to willing to take losses to support our air bases and stuff there? And three, are we going to be confident we can mitigate from nuclear escalation? I mean, at some point, you can't always just appease because of a threat of a nuclear war. You have to at some point have a red line and say, look, you're not going to go over this line. Otherwise, you might as well just surrender altogether. Having said that, where's that red line? And do we want to make it Taiwan? And do the Taiwanese people want it to go to that point? Are they willing to lose brothers, fathers, and daughters, and if bombs are dropping, or are they going to want to surrender? It's a tough question to answer. So, just my thoughts on a Friday evening. Hope you're able to enjoy this video, and I will by next week have published the Ukraine 2025 escalation, and then there's going to be some more deep dives into different states and whether or not what nuclear war would look like for that particular state or area based on the most highly probable targets. And then, the big one that I'm working on is going to take some time, though, that I have to be able to devote to it, would be, what if Able Archer did go nuclear? And so that's going to be a tough one because, man, those number of warheads and arsenals and stockpiles of time are just huge. So that's going to take some time. And, but also I was going to do, what if the Korean War went atomic at the time? So a few things I'm working on, but next one's going to be Ukraine 2025. Thanks. Enjoy yourselves. Have a nice beer or a scotch and a succulent Chinese meal.